Magic is all around your table in Dungeons & Dragons. But as the Dungeon Master, you're going to need to interpret a bunch of different spells quickly in order to keep the flow of the game constant. In this video, I'm going to explain how to be the basic master of magic at your D&D table. Before we even look at a spell, there's one concept that I have written on my DM's screen that I would also recommend that you add to yours, and that is the spell's components. Each spell has 1 to 4 components that will take place when a spell is cast. The verbal component means that a player would have to make a vocal command or word spoken with power when they cast the spell. I use the verbal component as a cue to see how many people around the player might notice that the player is casting a spell. The somatic component signifies that the player would need to make a series of movements with their body to activate the spell, from a hand wave to a dance. Now, the specific gesture is always flavor, but it ties back to who would know that there's magic going on right now. And then the material component is to check and see if you have the right physical components on the player who is casting the spell. Now, any component that does not have a specific cost associated with it, I will always rule can be replaced by a spellcasting focus, or it's found in the components pouch. Now, the last potential component of a spell is the ritual tag. If a spell is labeled as a ritual, it means the caster can opt to not expend a spell slot and take an extra 10 minutes to cast the spell. This is only for the casters that do have the ability to cast spells as a ritual, but regardless, this is something that exists for a few of our different full casters. It's important to note that if the spellcaster loses focus or concentration during this 10-minute period for any reason, they would not gain the benefit of this spell, but it also does not come at any particular cost to them either. Let's get to the hardest part, figuring out what the heck a spell does on the fly. Now, a full disclaimer, I recommend transparency with your players. You may rule that a spell works one way the first time you see it, but after reading it more closely, you may need to change that ruling going forward. That's more than okay. Just make sure you let your table know once that discovery is made so that they can rethink any strategies and don't have things sprung on them as well. With that preamble done, let's run a scenario. Our player wants to cast the spell Command on a running courier to make them stop. What do we need to take from this wall of text to make a quick and efficient ruling? First is casting time. Since this has a casting time of 1 action, it can happen right away. If it was longer, it becomes a little bit harder to pull off and may have needed an extra check, but we're good there. Now, range. Is the target within range? Can they be if the player uses their movement speed? Again, based off the situation, I don't see an issue yet. With components, this spell only takes a verbal component, which on its own might not give away that they're casting a spell. Next, we need to understand the text for keywords. It must be 1 word. It's a wisdom save. They cannot follow orders that directly harm themselves. And they can't understand if they don't speak the language. And finally, extra effects. Does the spell do anything extra if the player upcasts this in a higher spell slot? For instance, if the player used a 2nd level command, it could impact a 2nd target at the same time. So now we've used this truce idea, and we can see the full impact of the spell that is going to have on our game space. And then we can forge our path to resolve it by rolling that wisdom save and seeing if they follow the 1-word command. So remember truce, it has saved me several times, and I continue to use this whenever my players throw a new spell at me that I'm not quite familiar with. Now let's discuss special considerations for combat. In combat, there's a rule in Chapter 10 that states, a spell cast with a bonus action is especially swift. You must use a bonus action on your turn to cast the spell, provided that you have not already taken a bonus action this turn. You cannot cast another spell during the same turn, except for a cantrip with a casting time of 1 action. So beware of the players that are going to be using both bonus action and action spells, because you might want to limit them to only using that bonus action. But I'll be completely honest with you, this rule is inconsequential in 99% of circumstances. If a player is going to blow through their resources a little bit faster, usually it's fine. Just do your best to enforce things where you can. That's the general rule. Now, the last piece I want to talk about for DMing Magic is spell scrolls. Spell scrolls are a fantastic minor reward that I throw into my world. Firstly, I'll tell you the rules as written, and then I'm going to tell you an alternative method that I use and prefer. Now, the rules as written state that a spell scroll bears the words of a single spell, written in a mystical cipher. If the spell is on your class's spell list, you can read the spell scroll and cast it without providing material components. Otherwise, you can't use that scroll. You can use a scroll as though you were casting a spell, but it does not require the material's components, and the scroll is consumed through casting, not a spell slot. Now, this is a good baseline for spell scrolls, but I'm going to take this a step further, and I'm going to show you how I give my players some more agency. I separate spell scrolls into two different types, wizard scrolls and non-wizard scrolls. Any player can use any scroll, but a wizard can only copy wizard spells into their spellbook. If a player wants to use a spell scroll that's not on their spells list, or it is above the current level of their accessible magic, then they need to make a difficulty class plus spell level Arcana check. So if our wizard wanted to cast a Druid spell scroll at the 2nd level, they would be making a difficulty class 12 Arcana check to try and use that spell. This add in a bunch of extra magic into the world that can make any player have some extra oomph in a pinch and gives those players that extra agency. I've really liked having this rule at my table, but I can recognize that it's probably not for everyone. And that is all of the magical considerations that you're going to need to make to start making quick and effective rulings at your Dungeons & Dragons table. I hope you found this helpful, and I'll be covering similar topics in future videos. Happy adventuring, and I will see you in the next video.